Welcome everybody to Vernal Pools 101. My name is Brett Thelen. I'm the Science Director for the Harris Center for Conservation Education. For those of you who might be new to us, especially since we've got people from all over the place, the Harris Center is a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire. We help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and education for all ages. So if you're local to us, you might be interested to know we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that is open for hiking or birding or vernal pooling or other recreation. We coordinate conservation research on that protected land and throughout the region through a variety of community science projects, including a vernal pool inventory project. And then really at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. And one of the real silver linings of the pandemic has been this transition to Zoom, which has enabled us to feature sometimes speakers from further afield and to welcome people from all over to our talks. So we've got a lot of really great talks coming up on Zoom this spring, which you can find out more information about at harriscenter.org. And I like to always acknowledge that nothing that we do would be possible without the support of our donors. And I know there are some of you out there. So if you are a Harris Center supporter, thank you. If you're not yet, we encourage you to check us out at harriscenter.org. So today you're here to learn about vernal pools. I'm going to be giving the talk, but I also want to introduce Karen Seaver, who is our staff ecologist. The two of us have spent quite a bit of time poking around in vernal pools together. We don't get any echoing or feedback. So this morning we're going to talk about vernal pools, which are one of my very favorite habitats, and we are getting right into the season when they are most active and most fun to explore. So we're going to talk about what vernal pools are, how to know if you found one, why they're important, why they matter, some of the threats that they face, and then we're going to really dig into some of the different species that you can find in vernal pools and look at the egg masses of the amphibians who breed in these pools and learn how to tell them apart, one species from another. And then we'll end with some tips for exploring vernal pools on your own. So let's get started here. All right, so vernal pools are essentially small depressions in the forest floor, and they fill with melting rain, with melting snow and spring rains. And so there's a series of photos I'm going to show you that kind of show the life of a vernal pool throughout the year. And these are photos that came from the Vernal Pool Association, which is a wonderful Massachusetts-based organization dedicated to education about vernal pools. And the thing to note in this particular slide is that downed tree in the middle there. And so some of you who are in Maine and Vermont, your vernal pools might look like this right now. And here in Southwest New Hampshire, our pools looked like this a few weeks ago. Now down here, our pools starting to look more like this. So you can see that as temperatures warm, a few things happen. The ice in that pool melts and the water level starts to drop a bit. And that's both because temperatures are warmer and evaporation is happening. And it's also because trees are starting to pull more groundwater as they leaf out for spring. This is when vernal pools are in their prime in terms of the critters who use them. By late summer, that very same pool looks like this. So you can see that branch or that down tree that came through all pictures. So now it is completely dry. And this is an important feature of vernal pools. They hold water for some part of the year, but not typically all of the year. So for some local examples, for those of you who are in Southwest New Hampshire, here is a vernal pool that I visit every spring just to see what's going on in Nelson, New Hampshire. This is that pool in April. And if you visit that pool in late October, this is what it looks like. Completely dry. So this is important when we start to think about vernal pool protection, because if you visit a vernal pool on October 31st, you might not know it's a vernal pool at all because it might be bone dry. Another pool from Harris Center land in Hancock in April. and that same pool in early March. Another time when you might not notice it was there at all because it's blanketed by snow and just looks like another kind of spot in the land. So there's a lot of variability in vernal pools. They vary quite a bit in size, in shape, in how long they hold water, but they do have some characteristics in common. First, they are temporary and seasonal. Not every pool dries up every year, but vernal pools do dry up at some point. It might be once every 3 years, it might be every 4 years, it might be every year. For them to be used by amphibians, they need to hold water for 2 to 4 months each year. And the seasonal nature is really important. So they fill with water in the fall, winter, and spring and dry by late summer, typically. For amphibians to use them for breeding, which we'll talk about in a few moments, they need to be surrounded by woods. And this is because the amphibians who breed in vernal pools spend the rest of their lives in the woods and under the forest floor in the soil. So if you have no woods to support them for the rest of their time, you won't have amphibians coming to that vernal pool to lay their eggs each spring. Now, there's one exception to this, which is that there's also a really incredible community of invertebrates that can live in vernal pools. And we won't go into great detail about invertebrates today, with one exception. But there can be invertebrate communities that persist in vernal pools even if the woods are gone. And there's a really classic example of that for those of you who are local to the Monadnock region at Keene State College. Between Route 101 and the Keene State College athletic fields is a pool that has a really rich invertebrate life, including fairy shrimp, which we'll talk about. And there's really no more woods there. So there's no amphibians using that pool anymore, but it is still a vernal pool. But from an amphibian's perspective, you need woods. They tend to be small and shallow. So they tend not to be greater than a few feet deep. And they can range in size from 10 feet in diameter to 100 feet or more. It really is quite variable, but they're smaller than ponds or lakes. And they don't have a permanent connection to a perennial body of water, meaning they're not permanently connected to a river or a lake or a permanent wetland for the most part. And all of these things come together for one primary thing, which is that fish cannot survive in vernal pools. And that's important because fish eat amphibian eggs and amphibian young. And so the amphibian species who've adapted to breed in vernal pools have adapted to a place where there are fewer predators for their young. They don't have to have the same kind of defenses in place that they might in a lake or a pond or a permanent wetland. But they do have something else to worry about. So they've kind of have an evolutionary trade-off here, which is that they don't have to be worried as much about predators, although there are some predators in vernal pools, but they do need to worry about the threat of drying out. So some of you probably remember from your school days that amphibians have this kind of miraculous life cycle where they start off, many of them, as eggs in water and as larvae that have gills for breathing in water. And then they go through a miraculous metamorphosis where some of them grow lungs, they grow legs, they go through an entire transformation to be ready for life on land. And for the vernal pool species, this has to happen before that pool dries out. If you have a year when the pool dries out before the wood frog tadpoles have grown lungs or legs, those tadpoles won't make it that year. And so they have a very accelerated life cycle. This happens much more quickly than for other amphibian species who breed in more permanent bodies of water. For wood frogs, it can be just a few months from egg to froglet. And one important thing to note about that is that the time it takes depends a bit on temperature. So the warmer it is, the faster this all happens, which makes sense because the warmer it gets, the closer that pool is to drying out. So vernal pools are interesting too in that they have a two-part definition. So this is a vernal pool in Horatio Colony Nature Preserve in Keene. It's one of my favorite places to visit in the spring. Vernal pools have a physical definition. So they are an isolated body of water that dries up periodically, But they also have a biological definition, which is to say that they're defined by the species who breed in them. So if you find a body of water in the woods, an isolated pool like this, a wicked big puddle, as some people call them, and you can't find any evidence of breeding by a group of species that we'll talk about in a minute, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, Jefferson salamanders, then technically that body of water may not be considered as a vernal pool, especially in some of the states where you live in, like Massachusetts and Maine, where there are formal certification processes for vernal pools. You have to be able to prove that there is breeding by these specialized vernal pool species. Otherwise, it's just a wicked big puddle. So this word obligate, what does obligate species mean? Obligate or indicator or primary species is a word that means these are the species who require vernal pools for their survival. They are reliant on them, in this case, for breeding sites. Without vernal pools, these species would not continue to exist in our woods and on our landscape. Now there's a whole much larger group of other species that are called facultative or secondary species. These are species that use vernal pools in one way or another, but if vernal pools were to completely disappear from the landscape, these species would be able to find substitute habitats. So for obligate species in Southwest New Hampshire, there are 4 primary species. We're going to talk about each one in turn, but fairy shrimp, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and Jefferson salamanders. Those of you who live further afield, you may have some additional species that are in that mix, especially those of you who are further south than us. Amphibian diversity tends to increase the further south you go and decrease as you get north where things are colder. Facultative species run the gamut, everything from barred owls who hunt in vernal pools to dragonfly larvae to spotted turtles and Blanding's turtles. There's a whole mix of them. But if you want to if you want to document a vernal pool for protection of that pool through your state channels or through the Harris Center's Community Science Project, that's all really focused on these obligate species, these species who require vernal pools for their survival. And we're going to go through them one by one. And we're going to start with everybody's favorite, which is the spotted salamander. These are kind of the poster child for another community science project that we run called the Salamander Crossing Brigades. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but they're really remarkable salamanders. They are 8 to 10 inches long. They have this grayish skin with bright yellow polka dots on it. They can live 20 to 30 years if they're not eaten by an owl or run over by a car on their breeding migration. And we're going to kind of go through a little bit of a year in the life of a spotted salamander to give you a sense of where the vernal pools fit in the scheme of things. Those of you who've come to our Salamander Crossing Brigade training a few weeks ago, these slides will be familiar to you because they're a repeat from that. But I think it's a good reminder because we always talk about vernal pools this time of year and we focus on the pool itself and the eggs, but they're one part of this animal's life cycle. And these animals are connected to these pools, but they're also connected to other places, the other times of the year. So on the first warm, rainy nights of spring is when spotted salamanders get the most attention. And that's because on these nights, spotted salamanders, as well as wood frogs and Jefferson salamanders and other amphibian species are kind of coming to life for the year. They've spent their winter underground. Spotted salamanders went below the freeze line in small mammal burrows. That's where they've spent their winter, kind of waiting out, waiting for things to thaw. And once the ground has thawed and we start to get nighttime rains 40 degrees and above, that is the cue for spotted salamanders as well as wood frogs and Jefferson salamanders to clamber up from those underground burrows and start to move across the landscape and migrate to their vernal pool. I love this picture, which my friend Dave took, because you can see this salamander is still caked with mud. This is an animal that has just emerged from underground for the very first time that year and hasn't even been in the rain long enough for the rain to wash away the mud from underground. So they migrate typically less than a quarter mile to their vernal pool. And for many of them, this is the vernal pool where they themselves hatched out of an egg. They have what's known as strong site fidelity, attachment to place. So if their vernal pool is developed or destroyed in some way, they can find other breeding habitat, but it will be, but not always. They have a really strong attachment to their specific place. When they get there on these rainy nights and for the nights afterwards, they do what's called congressing, which I've heard people joke is basically a whole lot of nothing. So that's kind of maybe an appropriate name for it, but they're essentially swimming around in the pool at night. And it could be a group of 5 salamanders, it could be a group of 500 salamanders, depending on the size of that pool and the size of the woodlands surrounding that pool. But it's a breeding dance of sorts. And at some point during that, the male salamanders will swim to the bottom of the vernal pool and deposit what are called spermatophores, these little packets of sperm on the top of a little gelatinous platform. This is, these are done in clusters. They're very small. They kind of look like breadcrumbs in the pool. And this can happen, typically, it can happen even before the females arrive. It's very common for the first rainy night of the spring for the males of the species to migrate first, and then for the females to follow on the next rainy night or next series of rainy nights. So the males may be in the pool ahead of the females and depositing spermatophores. The spermatophores, they last, if they're not used by the females, they last on the bottom of the pool just a few days. So the males may have to go for another round if we had one rainy night and then they had to wait another week or two for females to arrive. The females select the spermatophores of their choosing. I do not know how they pick, but they absorb them into their cloacal opening and the eggs are then fertilized internally. So it's a really interesting thing that they have internal fertilization, but the males and females may or may not come into any physical contact with one another. And it's also quite common that the females will choose spermatophores from multiple males. So there was a study in Ithaca, New York that looked at spotted salamander egg masses and found that 70% of them had mixed paternity. So multiple contributions from multiple males. Then the female salamander will lay her egg mass. I love this picture that my friend Dave took because it shows this happening, which is just a remarkable moment to have captured. Spotted salamanders deposit 1 to 3 egg masses each year, and the females may, this is a huge effort for them energetically. They may not necessarily make eggs every year and do this every year. But they often will attach these eggs to twigs or branches or leaves. And we're going to talk a little bit more about egg masses in a little while, but this is what spotted salamander egg masses look like. They quickly grow in size by absorbing water, and then they can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to hatch. When they do, you'll have an adorable salamander larvae. This is a salamander larvae. You can tell it's a salamander because it has those gills at the base of its neck. If it were a frog larvae, or what we call a tadpole, it would not have visible gills like that. And this, for a sense of scale, it's gripping onto another vernal pool species known as a fingernail clam, which is about half the size of your pinky fingernail, for a sense of scale. So these guys can be an inch and a half long, these salamander larvae, but they're voracious predators. They're eating mosquito larvae and caddisflies and wood frog tadpoles if they can get their mouths on them, any other critters in that pool. And it'll take them another 2 to 3 months to grow and to eventually grow lungs and to grow legs that can support walking on land and underground. And by the end of the summer, when that pool dries out, they'll look like this. This is a juvenile young of the year that we found behind the Harris Center, tucked under a piece of bark. And at that point, they may hang tight close to their vernal pool. They may disperse further in the forest, but they then disappear under the forest floor for another 2 to 5 years. They don't reach reproductive maturity until they're 2 to 5 years old. And then when they are 2 to 5 years old, and for many years up to that, after that, up to 20 or 30 years, they will renew this cycle each spring on those first warm, rainy nights. The rest of their lives, most of us have never seen a spotted salamander because they spend 95% of their lives underground. The best chance for seeing them is on these warm, rainy spring nights, or, you know, the night after a rainy, warm spring night. If you go down to your local vernal pool with a good flashlight, you might see them swimming around. And occasionally they show up in people's unfinished basements following a tunnel that popped out there. But these are creatures that spend most of their lives underground, except for this annual cycle that's focused on vernal pools.
Can I break in with a couple questions from the group, Brett?
Yes,
about
please.
This? Emily asked about female spotted salamanders that might not produce eggs in a given year. Are they still going to make the trip to the vernal pools?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I don't know for sure, but I can't imagine that it would be worth the risk to them of possibly encountering predators or other hazards above ground. And we actually have had some years where we had a really long, dry spring where we didn't have nighttime rains, and we just saw far fewer eggs in the vernal pools those years. And the herpetologists I know that kind of talked about this thought, well, the females may have actually just chosen not to migrate and not to lay their eggs at all, just to reabsorb those eggs that year and save their resources for another year.
Okay, great. Paul, to that kind of part of the life cycle, we had a question from Paul about site choice. What can you tell us about how the spotted salamanders choose their pools? Is there a certain type of pool that's more desirable to them and that's more likely to set up the site fidelity that you referred to earlier?
That's a great question too. So my understanding is that most of them return to the pool where they were born. So they didn't choose it, their parents chose it, or their grandparents, or the many generations back. But the ones that they do colonize new sites. This happened actually at the Harris Center. We have a pool that was dug maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago as an educational pond. And now we have spotted salamanders that breed in it every year. So clearly some new ones didn't go to the place where they were born and they found this. And it may simply be that they came upon this first, that it was the first one they encountered. It was closest to where they overwintered. I can say that vernal pools, really shallow vernal pools that dry up quickly, don't support amphibian populations very well. They may be great places for fairy shrimp. But the pools do need to be deep enough and hold water for longer to support amphibians. So they would, deeper, bigger pools will support more salamanders and frogs. And so that might be a factor in how they choose as well, as proximity to where they overwintered.
Right. And then I always wonder about the effects of disturbance, right? You know, how that reorganizes things. One more quick question, then we'll let you get back and maybe take some more questions at the end. Could you talk about what the salamanders are eating / doing when they're underground for the vast majority of their lifetimes?
Yeah, I mean, they are eating invertebrates, so earthworms and beetles and snails and slugs and any other critters that live underground. That's their primary food source. It's interesting to note, you know, that spotted salamanders and wood frogs and Jefferson salamanders, their first priority when they arise in the spring is not eating. They are migrating exclusively. They are not stopping to eat. They are just heading to the vernal pool to lay their eggs. And so presumably, and I assume I don't know this for sure, but my assumption is that in the winter, all of that slows way down for spotted salamanders because there's probably it's colder and they're less active. But they're basically traveling through small mammal burrows. They set up territories that they can defend quite aggressively from other salamanders. If they've got a good spot with lots of worms and beetles and they want to keep that spot for themselves, they will get into spats with other salamanders under there. But they're just, you know, living their lives, I guess you could say, and feeding on whatever invertebrates they can find under the forest floor. Is there anything you would add to that, Karen?
I think that's right. And I think there's times where they are, you know, in the winter where they're not eating all that much. You know, there's periods of inactivity.
Right.
But yes, it never ceases to amaze me how they emerge in the spring, seemingly so well nourished. You know, they have an incredible way of like reserves. It's quite remarkable for organisms that technically don't have fat.
Right. I often think on those first spring nights when we see them, how shocking it must be to be spending, you know, the last 340 days of the year underground in the dark, and what that must smell like and feel like and look like for them, and then to emerge above ground in this whole kind of explosion of life and sensory perceptions that must be just very different for them. Okay, do we good for spotted salamander questions for now?
I think we're good for now. And then maybe we take some later that are more general. And I'm going to write some responses to people that are more straightforward.
Awesome. Okay. So that was our spotted salamander. In some places in the Monadnock region, we also have a related salamander breeding in vernal pools. This is the Jefferson blue spotted salamander complex. That's a real mouthful. There are Jefferson salamanders, there are blue spotted salamanders, and in places where they coexist, they often hybridize. And you can't tell from looking at them which one you've got. You actually have to do genetic testing. It's so complicated. It really challenges the very notion of what it means to be a species. And with these Jefferson complex salamanders, there are all female lineages even that practice what's called Kleptogenesis. So klepto meaning steal, genesis, genetic material. So they use the spermatophores from true Jefferson salamanders or true blue spotted salamanders to fertilize their eggs and initiate egg development, but none of the genetic material from those male salamanders is incorporated into their offspring. They basically are cloning themselves, which is quite remarkable. They are much less common. We definitely have them in Keene. We have them in Westmoreland and probably other places in the Monadnock region. But these are a species of special concern in New Hampshire, and I believe in some other New England states as well. So they are less common, but we do see them in some of our vernal pools. And then the third of the big three vernal pool amphibian species, especially here in the Monadnock region, are these guys, the wood frogs. They are about 3 inches long as adults. They're really distinctive dark mask behind each eye. And when they're in the vernal pool, one of the things that is very distinctive about them is the sound that the males make. I should say salamanders do not make sounds. They don't communicate that way primarily. They communicate through scent. But frogs make sounds, and I'm sure some of you have already heard these sounds this spring. I know they're last weekend they were going in Peterborough and Harrisville and Keene and this week as well. So, oops. So here's what they sound like. This is a recording from Robin Hood Park in Keene. Those are not ducks, those are wood frogs. And the wood frogs migrate at night. They will chorus like that on any warm afternoon and through the night. And that is the males. It's a breeding song, and it typically lasts for just a couple of weeks each spring, sometimes even less, but only in warm weather. So the last few days, there probably wasn't much chorusing here in the Monadnock region. It was a little too chilly. But once things warm up again, they'll start going again. And that's a great sound to help you find vernal pools in the early spring, because if you're walking through the woods and you hear that, you can follow your ears to the nearest vernal pool. So we're going to get back to the amphibians with their egg masses in a few, but there is one invertebrate species that deserves special mention in any talk on vernal pools. That is the fairy shrimp. They get that name because they seem to appear as if by magic each spring. I mean, if you think about, these are about an inch and a half long, orange or red in color, or sometimes brownish. These are shrimp, they're crustaceans, and they live their entire lives in a large puddle in the woods. And so it's really interesting to think about, how do they get there? They are a fully aquatic species. They cannot live on land. And yet they do exist in vernal pools throughout the Northeast. I will say that in the Monadnock region, they are less common. So I'd say about 10% of the pools that we know about have fairy shrimp in them. But they're really quite amazing, and they have an amazing life cycle. Their eggs, they overwinter essentially as eggs. So they live as adults for a very brief time, 4 to 6 weeks typically. They can even hatch in water under a skim of ice in the vernal pools. They're one of the earliest vernal pool active species. But their eggs need to dry out and be rehydrated. They also need to freeze and then thaw in order to hatch. So if you have a year where a vernal pool did not ever dry out completely, you won't have very many, if any, fairy shrimp in that pool the following year. The pool needs to dry and fill, freeze and thaw in order for the eggs to hatch. And some eggs can stay in that sediment for years and still be viable, waiting for the right conditions. There are actually fairy shrimp species that live in deserts and can be just dormant as eggs for decades even, which is really remarkable. Only 3% of their eggs hatch in any given flooding event. So there's a really rich seed bank of these eggs in the vernal pools where they occur. This is a photo from some of our Keene fairy shrimp. These are males. You can tell because if you look at their heads, they've got these kind of claspers. Those are what they use to grab onto the female during mating. And if they were females, they'd have a little egg sac right at the base. And they're really quite majestic creatures. They swim very gracefully. They swim upside down. So these are their gills that they also use for locomotion. They kind of undulate in a very graceful way. And they do not tolerate warm water. So they're mostly gone by early May, just as wood frog, tadpoles, and spotted salamander larvae are hatching out. Fairy shrimp are completing their life cycle. And that makes a lot of sense because fairy shrimp are delicious for every other creature who lives in a vernal pool that is a carnivore or omnivore. So it makes sense for them to try to complete their life cycle before all the predators are ready to eat them. And I do want to mention one other invertebrate that occurs in vernal pools and that occasionally people will confuse for fairy shrimp. So fairy shrimp do not occur in every vernal pool. And in fact, they're most common in my observations in pools that are near rivers or pools that are very shallow and dry out earlier in the season. This invertebrate on this slide is common in every vernal pool everywhere. And I'm going to play a little video to show you the difference in the way that they move. Because if you spend any time in vernal pools at all, you will absolutely see these guys. I'm wondering if anyone has a guess as to what they are. You can pop it in the chat. And if not, let's see. Yeah, mosquitoes. So these are mosquito larvae. And I am going to, let me just see something here. I'm going to see if we can see my screen without me having to pop out of the screen share, because I wanted to show you a little video. I guess I need to stop the share for a moment and do a new share. All right. Can you guys see this video queued up? Okay, it's not, I'm going to turn the peepers are peeping. So you can see fairy shrimp. There they are. There's a fairy shrimp, very graceful movement. You can also see the mosquito larvae, not graceful movement. Spastic is how I would describe it. So these guys are the mosquito larvae. They're sometimes called wrigglers. And they move in this very kind of herky-jerky way, whereas the fairy shrimp move in a very graceful, flowing way. There's a fairy shrimp again. So I just like to always show, people how they move, because it's a real significant difference between the two species. And every year I hear from someone who's so excited that they found fairy shrimp, and they send me a picture of mosquito larvae, and I always hate to burst their bubble. Mosquito larvae are very common in every vernal pool and are really great food for salamander larvae. Okay, so that's kind of like the 4 species you're most likely to see. Now, I always like to include a little bit about this, what I call the so what slides. Why should we care about vernal pools? What is their significance ecologically? So one of the things we've just been talking about is that they're important as specialized breeding habitat for these amphibians. This is showing wood frogs laying their eggs, and wood frogs in what's called amplexus, the kind of courtship pose. And one way of looking at, and so not only is it important breeding habitat for the amphibians, but the amphibians are important for the forests around that vernal pool. And one way of looking at this is this concept of biomass, where in its most simplistic form, you can calculate a number by looking at the mass of an individual animal, and then or plant, and multiplying it by the number of individuals of that particular species and getting a number. And it's often used for comparative purposes. So if I wanted to say, compare the biomass of human beings in the Harris Center building, I would take the mass of all the teaching staff and all the land protection staff and the research staff, and I'd add us all together and I get a number. And then maybe I want to compare that to the biomass of ants or mice in the Harris Center building. And ants or mice are much smaller in mass as individuals, but they tend to be much more numerous. And so sometimes, those numbers might surprise you. And so a biologist did this looking at vernal pool breeding amphibians in Massachusetts, and found that the biomass of the vernal pool breeding amphibians was greater than that of all the breeding birds and small mammals in the 50 acres or so surrounding that vernal pool. So what does that mean? It means there's a lot of energy moving through our forests in the bodies of these amphibians. And that primarily manifests in the food web. So they are important prey for nearly every vertebrate: herons and owls and foxes and turtles, snakes, both as adults and as young. So here's a very small wood frog on the tip of someone's finger. It's not uncommon for a small vernal pool to produce 10,000 wood frogs. And if they're lucky, 10 will make it to adulthood. The rest are food. The egg masses are food too. So if you think about what our woods look like in early April, and they are pretty brown. There's not a lot of, there's just not a lot of food for animals who've spent a long, hungry winter. There's no fruit yet. Nuts have been mostly eaten from last year. There's no buds. There's no flying insects, or very few. So if you are an animal who has spent a long, lean winter and you stumble across a vernal pool filled with these nuggets of protein, and the adult animals who might still be in the pool who deposited these eggs, it's like a bonanza for you. And there are certain turtle species and other animals who seek out vernal pools specifically for the food source in early spring. They're also really important predators. So amphibians eat an incredible number of insects and other invertebrates each year. And in fact, there was some research that showed that mosquito larvae preferentially selected water bodies with fewer spotted salamander larvae in them as places for their young, because the mosquitoes want their young to survive too. So they'd rather put those eggs in places where fewer predators. So more spotted salamanders, it may mean fewer mosquitoes, which is good for everybody. Vernal pools also have extremely high biodiversity. So they're small places, but they contain they contain huge numbers of species, or serve as a resource for hundreds of species. More than 550 different species have been documented in New England vernal pools. These are largely invertebrates. You can see here caddisflies, fingernail clams, but so some of these are very small species that we don't see very readily. But for a place that can be 20 feet long by 20 by 20 feet, it's incredible how many species that they can contain. And they also serve as really important stepping stones, wet places in the woods that are enable other species who need this kind of shelter and protection of wet spots to move from one place to a next. Turtles, birds, and small mammals. And so if you lose vernal pools in the landscape, then you could lose these species as well. Because they're small and seasonal, they're also highly vulnerable. If you don't look for them at the right time of year, you might not know that they're there at all, and they don't have the same kind of regulatory protection as permanent wetlands or lakes or ponds. So this is an instance of someone who was doing some work on a property and they didn't know there was a vernal pool there. And so this pool was unfortunately destroyed by this, this clearing, and you can see the wood frog eggs that are kind of drying after being exposed in the pool. This was a conservation conscious landowner who was doing some habitat restoration work, but just didn't know the vernal pool was there until it was too late. So direct loss of pools is a real concern, especially if you're not looking for them at the right time of year. Also direct loss of adjacent upland habitat. So you need the surrounding woods to be habitat for the amphibians who are breeding in those pools. So if you have less than 30% woods surrounding a pool, you're not likely to have spotted salamanders using that pool anymore. This is not to say that you can't do forestry in the vicinity of vernal pools, but you do need to take special care. There are best practices for that kind of forestry if you have vernal pools on the landscape. And of course, habitat fragmentation is an issue for all kinds of habitats, but especially for vernal pools. This is a diagram from a book that's showing a vernal pool complex where you might have had species and individuals moving between the pools, ensuring good genetic diversity, which enables them to be more resilient in the face of different threats like disease. And so if a road were to be put in between, two of those pools might dry up completely, and then they could no longer serve as those stepping stones from one pool to another. Similarly, if you put a house in the middle, you might have some connectivity, but you might have lost the greater connectivity there. And pools near roads face special threats as well because of this migration that happens overland. In many places, amphibians need to cross roads, and it is dangerous for them. There are some really shocking studies that show the number of amphibians dying on roads. And if you think about on these migration nights, these big nights, there are literally thousands of amphibians migrating across the landscape, and hundreds can be on a road at any given time. And so it doesn't take a lot of cars to do a lot of damage. And road salt is also an issue for roadside pools. High salt in vernal pools can affect the survivorship of spotted salamander and wood frog embryos and can also make them more vulnerable to disease. And of course, the big question is climate change. How will this affect our pools? As temperatures warm, it's very likely that our pools may not hold water for as long, which could be a problem if they dry up before the amphibians are able to metamorphose. We also have shorter winters and shallower snowpacks, which means that each spring we may be starting off with shallower pools with less water in them that are likely to dry up more quickly. And amphibians are resilient. They can deal with 1 or 2 bad years. It's just a question of how many bad years in a row are we going to have as a result of climate change? This is a big question. So the climate change question is a big one that is global in scale as well as local. All these other questions about vernal pool protection are very local, and we can protect pools but not if we don't know where they are. And so that's a really important aspect of vernal pool protection, is looking for them at the right time of year and documenting them. And I'm not going to go into great detail about our vernal pool project, but we have had an ongoing vernal pool inventory project that the Harris Center has been coordinating since 2007. And we have information on our website if you would like to document pools as part of that. We've got a volunteer handbook and data forms that kind of walk you through the process. If you live outside of the Monadnock region, there are other organizations coordinating similar efforts. We have a simplified data form. This is consistent with the statewide data form that New Hampshire Fish and Game uses, although ours is more streamlined and doesn't have quite as many questions as the state form does. But we would ask, if you do find a pool and that you want to document, we have a data form you fill out with basic information about location and the number of egg masses you've seen. And then we ask people to send us pictures of the pool, of the egg masses, so that when you say that you saw spotted salamander eggs, we have proof that you know that you were right, that they are in fact spotted salamander eggs, and a sketch of the pool, so that if we want to revisit it, we have information that can help us find it again and know that we're in the right place. Because remember, if we go back in November, we might not see a pool there at all. And in fact, we had some pools that were documented by interns one year on a piece of land where there was going to be some forestry happening. And the forester went out in October with the GPS points we gave him. And he said, you know, I think you're mistaken. I don't think there's a pool here. I didn't see anything. And he shared his photo of the place, and we compared it to the photo our interns took earlier in the year, and he was in the exact same place. He just couldn't tell it was a vernal pool. And so that's why the photo documentation is really helpful. And then once we knew that it was there, we asked him to change his forestry plans a bit in order to provide a protective buffer for that pool. And what we do with the data on this is that we have a map that includes data from public lands or private lands where the landowner has given us explicit permission to go out and collect this data. And we share that in Southwest New Hampshire with the Southwest Region Planning Commission, as well as land managers. And anyone can go and open this map and click on any of those dots and see some pictures and information about that pool. And so far we've got over 340 pools in about 15 towns in the Monadnock region. If you're not local to the Monadnock region, New Hampshire Fish and Game is also welcomes vernal pool data through their New Hampshire Wildlife Sightings website for other parts of New Hampshire. There are also vernal pool documentation efforts in Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts. The Maine and Massachusetts ones, each one is a little bit different in the information that it collects. Maine and Massachusetts ones are different in that there is legal protection for certified vernal pools in those states. So if you, for certain vernal pools anyway, that have certain species in them or certain numbers of egg masses. And so if you document pools in those places, they can be legally protected. And so there's a little bit of a more rigorous documentation process for those states. So getting to some of the egg masses, how do you know what's what if you see egg masses in a vernal pool? We're going to start with our wood frogs. These egg masses are starting to appear right now in vernal pools in the Monadnock region. Wood frog egg masses start as the size of walnuts, really dark, concentrated black dots like you see in this middle picture here. They quickly absorb water. So in about maybe 8 to 12 hours, that egg mass will look like this. And in a day or so later, it'll look like this. They are distinctive because there's a little bit of goo around each individual egg, which gives it a very bumpy appearance. They're also often close to the surface of the water. So this is just to show, this is the same egg mass about 12 hours apart, and then another 12 hours after that. They can take 2 to 3 weeks to hatch. The closer they get to hatch, the less distinct they become. This is a cluster of wood frog egg masses filled with algae. It's almost hard to tell that they're wood frog egg masses. You would have had to go out here maybe a week or two before to see that bumpier look to them. But they each have a little black dot in the middle. That's the embryo. And the clusters can have up to 1,000 or 1,500 eggs in each one. They're often laid communally. So in a one or two parts of the vernal pool, this actually can help them develop more quickly because each one of those little black embryos can absorb heat. And then they can actually, when you have a bunch of wood frog egg masses together, they can actually raise the water temperature, which ensures faster development. So in this pool, those are all that little bumpy, broken surface. That's wood frog eggs. As they get close to hatch, they get filled with a green algae, which is the tadpole's first meal. These are the tadpoles. They hang out near the egg mass for a day or two after they hatch, impersonating pine needles or hemlock needles and trying not to get eaten. So that's wood frogs. Spotted salamanders are a little different. Their egg masses are kind of milky, white in color or clear. And they're all, instead of having goo around each individual egg, like in the wood frogs, spotted salamanders have all of the eggs together with a mass of a gelatinous kind of envelope surrounding all of them, which gives them a smoother appearance and also a firmer appearance. So this, and you can also sometimes see the little membrane around each individual egg more clearly. So this is the same spotted salamander egg masses underwater and above water. They have a really firm texture and kind of a smoother outer envelope. And they can vary in size and in number of eggs from 30 eggs to 250 eggs. That I think is related somewhat to the age and size of the female. So these are all spotted salamander eggs in my hand to give you a sense of how different they can be in size. And they, where wood frog egg masses tend to be spherical, like a softball or grapefruit, these can be kind of more kidney shaped. They also grow algae as they get closer to hatching. They can take 4 to 8 weeks to hatch. The algae is a good thing. It's actually, there's a symbiotic relationship where the algae provide oxygen for the developing embryos and the embryos provide fertilizer for that algae. But again, you can see how firm these egg masses are. It's like Jell-O. And here they are just about ready to hatch. You can see the gills just are already developed on those larvae. Jefferson blue-spotted salamanders also have egg masses, central egg masses surrounded by an outer envelope like the spotteds, but it's a much looser texture. Very drippy and far fewer eggs. So there can be as few as 10 or 12 eggs up to about 75 or so. They're often laid linearly, kind of like cigars or something along a twig. So here's a picture of some from Robin Hood Park that Karen took a few years ago that show how they, so instead of being spherical and round like a softball, like wood frog egg masses, or kidney shaped like spotted salamanders, these Jefferson salamanders are often linear. Here they are about to hatch. And also one thing about Jefferson salamander egg masses, because of that weird genetic thing that happens, they have a high percentage of inviable eggs, which look like little white pearls. That's a fungus that has taken over the embryo. That embryo it has not survived and will not hatch. There tend to be a high number of these in your Jefferson blue spotted complex eggs. So just a comparison in terms of texture, spotted salamander eggs are like Jell-O, firm. Jefferson salamander eggs are loose and drippy, like jelly. They also, if you're not sure, if you can see that membrane, the spotted salamander eggs have a wide membrane around each embryo, which makes them look kind of hazy or foggy or milky in appearance. They almost have a glow to them. And the Jefferson salamanders have a much narrower membrane that sometimes you can't even see. So we've got 2 egg masses here from 2 different species. So you can kind of quiz yourself. This top one, the top left up here, you can see the wide membranes and kind of more of a spherical or kidney shape. And then down here, you can see narrower membranes, more of a linear shape, and this one little inviable egg here. So you can quiz yourself. This top one, what do you think? Spotted. Bottom one, Jefferson. So we do have a really great, we have a link to a really great video on egg mass ID produced by folks up at University of Maine on our website that if you're really thinking that you want to learn more about this, I'd encourage you to check it out. We also have egg mass ID sheets to help you. But I always like to think of, the 3 types of food. Jefferson salamander eggs are like jelly, spotted salamander eggs are like Jell-O, and wood frog eggs are kind of like tapioca pudding. So I know we're getting close to our time. I just have a few tips I want to offer for if you decide to go out looking for vernal pools, and then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. So first, I just need to always say landowner permission is a really important issue. If you're on public land, you don't need to worry about it, but you can't just go onto private land, especially here in New Hampshire, without permission from the landowner to look at their pools or to collect data about their pools. The data piece is especially important in places like Massachusetts and Maine, where if you submit the data from that pool to the state, it could lead to legal protection of that pool and limit what that landowner can do with their land. And so it's really key that you not go venturing off without permission to be wherever you are. You don't have to worry about this for public lands. This time of year, you can, on a warm afternoon, you can follow your ears to find vernal pools. This is happening in the Monadnock region. This weekend, wood frogs will be chorusing. You can go out and listen for them. And you might not see the pool at first, but follow your ears and you'll find it. This is a short window, only a couple of weeks each spring in the beginning. If you're going to handle egg masses, it's really important that you handle them gently with care, that you try not to detach them from the attachment sites, the twigs and leaves that they're attached to, and really vital that you have no toxins on your hands. That includes hand sanitizer. This can be harmful to the amphibians. So no bug spray, no hand sanitizer if you're going to touch amphibian eggs at all. And in general, I only really recommend touching them if you can reach them from the edge of the pool. So I don't recommend going into pools. In Maine or Massachusetts, they need egg mass counts in order to certify a vernal pool as what they call a significant vernal pool. It's based on the number of egg masses in the pool. And so you may need to wade into a pool if you want to document it and certify it. If you don't need to do that, it's best not to, because there are tons of critters under the leaf litter that you could be stepping on. It's very easy to dislodge egg masses. So in terms of looking at them, really try to look just for the egg masses that you can see or reach from the edge of the pool, and only handle them if it's necessary for photo documentation or educational purposes. Limit your disturbance of these special places when you can. Similarly, I don't recommend going vernal pooling with your dog, because they will be really excited to see a body of water and may plunge right in, and that could really dislodge or disrupt eggs and adult. There's also a growing concern about disease. And so if you're going from one vernal pool to another, it's important to disinfect your boots and any other gear that might go into that vernal pool, rinsing off any muck, applying a 3 or 4% bleach solution, and letting them air dry before you go from one pool to the next. This will help prevent disease transmission that can be is less of an issue in northern New England because of our cold winters, but in southern parts of the country and other parts of the world have really devastated amphibian populations. So this is a way that we can not contribute to that problem. Clear, calm days are better for seeing through the surface of the water to see eggs. When it's windy and the water's whipped up, you might not be able to see very well. Also, polarized sunglasses, super helpful for seeing through the water. Otherwise, it can be a lot of glare and you might not see the eggs very well. And then earlier in the season is better for your own enjoyment, because the longer you wait, the more black flies and mosquitoes will be present at these sites, and the less fun it will be for you. The amphibians don't care, but you will care. And also, amphibian egg masses generally will have hatched in our neck of the woods by the end of May, and this year maybe even earlier, because the season got such an early start. So
there's been a few about one particular topic, which is, what about creating vernal pools on one's own land? And then also kind of a related topic, what about as forests regenerate, after a disturbance like logging? Is there evidence that the pools regenerate as well?
Those are really good questions. So there has been a lot of research into creating vernal pool habitat. And it is an exceptionally difficult thing to do to get the hydrology right, because vernal pools have soils and positions on the landscape as such that they're holding water for just long enough, but not too long. And it's been very difficult for scientists to recreate functional vernal pools. It's not impossible, but it is far more difficult than you might think, and certainly more difficult than protecting the pools that we already have. So it can be done, but it's complicated to do it well. In terms of vernal pools being repopulated, I would think that as long as you have woods nearby, where spotted salamanders and wood frogs can kind of emigrate from, can find their way to a new pool once a land reforests, yes, I think that that's possible, but not if you have hundreds of acres, cleared, and there's no place for them to, there's no what they call source population for these animals to come from.
Another question was about, do you have any idea about the ratio between vernal pools that persist for multiple years versus ones that dry up annually? I don't
know. There's probably research on that in certain, like Hubbard Brook experimental forests might have something on that, but I don't know. And a lot of it is highly variable depending on what kind of weather you get each year. If it's a warm, dry year, pools will, more pools are going to dry up. But I don't know about percentages or ratio.
Yeah, that's a tough one, I think. One question I know that's much up your alley, asked about how best to photograph or, take videos of these vernal pool critters.
So one thing that I sometimes will do is I'll bring like a white plastic dish pan out with me to put egg masses in, or the critters are tougher because critters move. So there are people who will go out with GoPros that are underwater GoPros and take pictures just by putting their camera underneath the water. There's some amazing photos out there, more every year as the technology gets easier and more accessible. For me, like when I'm documenting a vernal pool for data purposes, I bring either a whiteboard or a dish pan to provide some contrast behind the egg masses so that you can see the shape of the egg masses and the texture of them. And I just kind of, and also so that they don't blend in as well with the leaf litter in the background. So like a clean white plastic dish pan or a whiteboard can be helpful for providing that. Those aren't pretty pictures, those are data pictures. I'm not, it's hard to get pictures of the actual larvae because they move pretty quick. So I tend to stick to the egg masses because they stay where they, they stay in one place.
Okay, speaking of not staying in one place, what do you know about how far the adults can range in distance from their non-breeding season to where they visit?
There's been, I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know the full range. I know that there have been a lot of studies tracking them from their wintering sites to their vernal pools, and those tend to be a quarter mile or less. But I don't know, like in the summer, wood frogs can actually range quite widely through the woods in the summer, and it may be wider. There's a lot of discussion around that because in Massachusetts, there's a 100-foot buffer, protective buffer of legal protection around vernal pools, and 100 feet is clearly not enough to protect the related habitat for wood frogs and spotted salamanders, because they certainly range more widely than that. But I don't think it'd be more than a few miles. I'd be pretty surprised if it was further than a mile or two total.
And I've shared the Harris Center vernal pool map in the chat. Some other folks have asked about, how can I find out more about vernal pools nearby me? I'm hearing, Temple, Sullivan County. Do you know of other resources for vernal pools that are sort of beyond Harris Center ones?
I don't know of public-facing maps like ours. Fish and Game requests and solicits reports of vernal pools throughout the state of New Hampshire, and you can submit to them, and I encourage you to do that if you are outside of our region. But you won't be able to see other people's pools because your data goes into their site and then into their records, but isn't put back out more publicly. You might find some vernal pool data on iNaturalist.org, which is a citizen science website and app where people submit all kinds of species observations. So if you searched by spotted salamander or wood frog and your location, you might find vernal pools that way. Vermont has a really impressive vernal pool map for the entire state that the Vermont Center for Eco Studies pulled together. So you can find that there. And Massachusetts, I think, has them available too through through their state fish and wildlife agency. They've got a map of all the certified pools in the state that you can see. You might need to do a little Googling to find it, but I know that it's available. In New Hampshire, it's less available.
What about, there's a question about hybridization, presumably between, Jefferson, blue spotted. Do you want to talk about that? Maybe just what you know about that?
It's very complicated. The assumption in any place where both of those species exist is that hybrids also exist and may even be the dominant kind of species or type of salamander you'd find. I do know that I know a biologist who sent some salamanders or egg masses from Keene for genetic testing and found that we did have true Jeffersons in Keene as well as the hybrids, but it's basically widely assumed that most places are hybrids, except I do think there are some parts in Maine that may have true blue spotted, but it's a topic of ongoing research, that the kind of genetic complexities of that hybridization. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's.
Looks like one more here for us right now, which is folks are talking about noticing roadside vernal pools and wondering if they, the animals in there are adversely affected by litter, which often ends up nearby. And then this awesome person is thinking about, would collecting the trash be more of a detriment than a benefit?
I think it would be a benefit. I don't know for sure. I haven't read any papers on litter in roadside ditches and vernal pools. I think the biggest concerns there are road salt and also sediment, because if the egg masses get coated in sediment, then oxygen exchange doesn't happen as well, and they may not develop normally. But there are a surprising number of amphibians breeding in roadside ditches that are functioning as vernal pools. And I would think, especially early in the season when there aren't very many egg masses yet, it would be great if you are wanting to do something to help to clean those pools out, because all of that litter may also be an accumulation point for road chemicals or other things that can kind of, oils that could glean onto them. And I think it's always better for there to be less litter. And I don't think it'd be too disruptive, especially early in the season when there may not be that many eggs yet. So cool. Well, I will. I know we're over time a bit, so I want everyone to be able to go out and enjoy their spring Saturday. But I will just remind you that we have a lot of great vernal pool resources at harriscenter.org/vernal-pool-project, and we've got links to the state of Maine's great egg mass video, our own egg mass ID sheets that you can download and print out, as well as the handbook that outlines the process for vernal pool documentation. And everyone who registered for this, I'll send an email in the coming week. I'm hoping to host an in-person outing to look at egg masses hands-on and practice some egg mass ID, and also filling out our data forms if you are hoping to collect data for inclusion in our community science project. So that will probably be at the Harris Center in the next week or two, depending on whether and when the egg masses appear. So keep an eye out in your email for that. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your sunny Saturday to join us to learn about vernal pools. I hope you venture out and explore some and enjoy them in your neck of the woods.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.